The moment Daniel Whitmore slapped me, 500 guests went completely silent. Crystal chandeliers, investors from across the country, phones already rising into the air, and my daughter, Olivia, standing just a few feet away in her wedding dress, frozen, saying nothing. My cheek burned, but what hurt more was realizing no one in that ballroom knew the truth, that I had secretly paid for every dollar of this $420,000 wedding, or that just days earlier, I discovered Daniel's company didn't exist, his investors weren't real, and he was drowning in debt. But as he lowered his hand and tried to smile like nothing happened, I realized something cold. Daniel Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of his life because he didn't know. I hadn't come to this wedding to celebrate. I had come prepared, and sometimes the most dangerous lies collapse best in front of an audience. My name is Caroline Hayes, and the first time I met Daniel Whitmore, I remember thinking he looked like someone who had practiced being impressive, not because anything about him was obviously wrong, but because everything about him felt slightly too polished, from the tailored navy suit he wore to a casual dinner, to the expensive watch he positioned just enough under the restaurant lighting whenever he lifted his glass, to the calm, confident smile he gave me when my daughter, Olivia, introduced us at a quiet steakhouse overlooking Boston Harbor, the kind of place where the lighting is low and the conversations feel private. And at first I told myself I was just being overly protective because Olivia hadn't looked this happy in years. Her voice lighter, her posture relaxed, the kind of happiness that makes a mother want to believe everything is finally going right, especially after raising her alone since my husband Michael died 12 years earlier. And for a long time after his death, our lives had revolved around survival, keeping the family logistics company afloat, keeping Olivia in school, keeping the house, keeping the grief from swallowing everything. And somehow, slowly, I managed to rebuild, turning Michael's mid-sized regional company into something stable and growing, something that no longer felt fragile every time the phone rang late at night. But success never changed one thing about me. I notice people, especially the ones who get close to my daughter. And that night, while Daniel spoke smoothly about his startup, I noticed things Olivia didn't, like how his questions sounded polite but felt calculated. How long had I been running the company? How many employees did we have now? Had we expanded outside New England? And every time I answered, Daniel gave a slow nod like he was filing numbers away somewhere private. And when he talked about his own work, he used phrases that sounded impressive but vague. Words like pre-seed momentum, strategic positioning, and high net worth conversations. And I've spent too many years in business not to recognize when someone is talking around something instead of about it. But Olivia watched him with admiration, her smile soft, her fingers lightly resting on his arm, and when Daniel ordered the most expensive bottle of wine without looking at the price and joked, "When you're building a future, you start thinking bigger." Olivia laughed, but I noticed something small, the way her hand tightened slightly around her napkin, a subtle movement most people wouldn't see. And later, when I asked Daniel where his company was currently based, he gave a broad answer about operating flexibly while investor conversations matured. And something in my chest cooled right then, because that wasn't an answer, it was a shield. And still, I stayed polite, because instinct isn't proof, and when it comes to your daughter, proof matters. And as the months passed, Olivia began changing in ways that were easy to miss at first. Fewer calls, shorter visits, new phrases that sounded more like Daniel than her, comments about thinking bigger and old-fashioned caution. And then came the engagement, a rooftop proposal, a massive diamond ring, and wedding plans that expanded almost overnight, from a small ceremony to something far more elaborate. And one afternoon during a hotel ballroom walkthrough, I heard Daniel casually ask the planner how many investors could be seated close enough to the stage to feel personally included. And I remember feeling a quiet unease settle in my chest, because weddings are supposed to gather family, not potential investors. And as Olivia stood beside him, choosing flowers, smiling and excited, I realized something I didn't want to admit yet. Daniel wasn't just planning a wedding, he was building something carefully designed, something that looked perfect from the outside. And as I drove home that night, Boston lights reflecting across the wet road, I kept replaying the evening in my mind, the polished answers, the investor seating, the careful charm. And I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as one quiet thought settled in my chest. Was I being overly protective, or was my daughter about to marry someone who saw her not as a partner, but part of his plan? And if you were in my place, would you trust your instinct, or would you wait for proof? At first, I told myself I was overthinking because weddings have a way of growing larger than anyone expects. And Olivia seemed genuinely happy as the plans expanded, her excitement soft and sincere every time she talked about flowers, music, or the view from the ballroom overlooking Boston Harbor. And I wanted to believe that everything was normal. But the more I watched Daniel, the more I realized his focus wasn't on the wedding itself, it was on the audience. Because during planning meetings at the Grand Harbor Hotel, Daniel rarely discussed vows or the ceremony. Instead, he asked about lighting angles, when the ballroom doors would open, whether the couple's entrance could be timed with the music building, and how long guests would be seated before speeches began. And the wedding planner, Lindsay Moore, answered professionally, but I noticed how Daniel listened. Not like a groom imagining a meaningful moment, but like someone designing an event meant to impress. And Olivia didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she chose not to because she was busy tasting cakes, comparing fabric samples, and laughing softly whenever Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders. And for a while, I stayed quiet because I didn't want to ruin her happiness over a feeling I still couldn't prove. But then the guest list started growing, 200, then 300, then nearly 500 names. And when I gently asked Olivia whether she even knew half the people attending, she smiled and admitted she didn't, but Daniel had explained they were important connections. And that phrase stayed with me long after she left, because weddings gather family, not connections. And a week later, during another planning meeting, Lindsay handed us a seating chart draft, and I noticed several tables labeled VIP positioned close to the stage. And when I asked who those seats were for, Daniel answered quickly, saying they were close professional contacts. And something about the way he said professional made my stomach tighten, because it sounded more like a conference than a wedding. And that same afternoon, while Lindsay stepped out to answer a phone call, Daniel leaned closer to Olivia and casually mentioned which investors might attend, listing names confidently. And Olivia smiled proudly, telling him she admired how driven he was. And I watched quietly, realizing Daniel had slowly shaped her thinking so ambition sounded like love. And then a few days later, something happened that unsettled me even more. Because I arrived early for a venue walkthrough and heard Daniel speaking quietly in the hallway, his voice calm but controlled. And I caught a few words. After the ceremony, they'll all be there, perfect environment. And I stopped walking, my breath catching slightly, because I recognized that tone, the same tone executives use before a major pitch. And when Daniel entered the ballroom moments later, he looked perfectly composed, greeting me warmly. But from that moment forward, I couldn't ignore the possibility that this wedding wasn't just about marriage, it was about credibility. And that thought followed me home, rain tapping softly against my windshield, until I finally did something I rarely do. I called Mark Sullivan, a private investigator I had worked with years earlier during a fraud issue involving my company. And when he answered, I hesitated only briefly before asking him to quietly look into Daniel Whitmore, because something about this entire situation felt too carefully constructed. And over the next week, I found myself noticing more small things. Olivia mentioning Daniel was between offices, Daniel avoiding direct answers about investors, the way he always shifted conversations away from specifics. And then, 8 days later, Mark called me back, and I knew from the silence before he spoke that something wasn't right, because he told me Daniel's startup had no official filings, no registered funding, no investor records, and Daniel himself was carrying over $2 million in personal debt. And I sat quietly at my desk, staring out at the Boston skyline, as everything began to connect. The oversized wedding, the investor guest list, the carefully designed event, the charm, the performance. All of it wasn't about love, it was about credibility. And suddenly, my daughter's wedding didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a stage. And Daniel wasn't just planning a marriage, he was preparing for the biggest pitch of his life. And as I sat there holding the phone, one thought settled heavily in my chest. The wedding was only 2 weeks away, and now I had to decide whether to stop everything now or wait and gather more proof. And if you were in my position, would you tell your daughter immediately and risk breaking her trust, or would you wait and gather more proof before everything collapsed? The morning of the wedding arrived with a quiet gray sky over Boston Harbor. And I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror, fastening the silver necklace my late husband Michael had given me years earlier, my hands slightly unsteady as I tried to calm the weight sitting in my chest. Because while every parent hopes for joy on their child's wedding day, I was carrying something heavier. The knowledge that the man Olivia was about to marry had built his entire future on something that might not be real. And by the time I arrived at the Grand Harbor Hotel, the ballroom was already glowing with warm light from crystal chandeliers, white roses lining every table, and soft orchestral music drifting across the room as guests filled their seats. And I noticed immediately the clusters of well-dressed men speaking quietly near the front tables, faces I recognized from Mark's report. Venture investors, executives, people Daniel clearly wanted to impress. And as I moved through the crowd, greeting relatives and familiar business contacts, I saw Daniel standing near the entrance, smiling confidently, shaking hands, leaning slightly forward when he spoke, the kind of body language someone uses when they're selling something. And for a moment, I wondered if I should confront him before the ceremony. But when I went upstairs to the bridal suite and saw Olivia standing near the window in her dress, sunlight filtering softly around her, everything inside me hesitated, because she looked genuinely happy, nervous but glowing. And when she hugged me and whispered, "I'm so glad you're here, Mom," I felt how fragile that moment was, how easily the truth could shatter her. And I told myself I would wait just a little longer, just enough to understand exactly what Daniel planned to do. And the ceremony itself passed in a blur of quiet music and soft applause. Olivia walking down the aisle, Daniel taking her hands, the officiant speaking about trust and commitment, while I sat in the front row, my thoughts racing. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, the room filled with applause and camera flashes. And for a brief moment, everything looked perfect. But as the reception began, I watched Daniel carefully. And within minutes, he was already moving between tables, greeting investors, laughing confidently, leaning close in conversation. And I realized Mark had been right, because Daniel wasn't celebrating, he was networking. And then, during the cocktail hour, I noticed something else. Daniel guiding specific guests toward the front tables, quietly introducing Olivia as if she were part of a presentation. And the more I watched, the more the wedding felt like a carefully designed stage. And later, just before the speeches began, I stepped into the hallway to steady myself, the soft hum of conversation fading behind the closed doors. And that's when Daniel followed me, his smile still polite, but his eyes sharper now. And he spoke quietly, asking if everything was all right, and I answered calmly, telling him I knew about the debt, the non-existent startup, and the investors he was trying to impress. And for the first time since I had met him, Daniel's composure slipped, just slightly, his jaw tightening before he leaned closer and whispered, still smiling for anyone walking past, "You don't understand how much is riding on tonight." And his hand tightened briefly around my arm, not violent, but controlled, deliberate. And in that moment, I understood something cold. Daniel wasn't panicking, he was calculating. And when I told him I was protecting my daughter, his expression hardened, and he quietly warned me that exposing him would embarrass Olivia more than anyone else. And then he released my arm and stepped back, his smile returning instantly as the ballroom doors opened again. And moments later, we were both back inside, the speeches beginning. Daniel speaking first, charming as ever, thanking guests, talking about ambition, opportunity, and building a future. and the investors near the front tables listened carefully, some nodding, some smiling. And when he finished, applause filled the room. And then the microphone passed to me. And as I stood, 500 guests turned toward me, the room falling silent again. And I began calmly, thanking everyone for coming, speaking about Olivia's childhood, her strength, her kindness. And then I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough before explaining that I had quietly funded the entire wedding, every detail, every expense. And I watched surprise ripple across the room, Daniel's expression tightening slightly. And then I continued, explaining that love should be built on honesty, and that sometimes appearances can be misleading. And I carefully revealed just enough: the missing company filings, the debt, the illusion, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. Investors exchanging glances, whispers spreading across tables, and Olivia's face slowly shifting from confusion to realization. And Daniel stood still, his composure cracking quietly in front of everyone he had tried to impress. And when I finished speaking, I stepped away from the microphone, my hands steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. And as the music failed to resume and guests began quietly murmuring, I realized something simple. Daniel hadn't just tried to use this wedding to build credibility, he had built it on something fragile. And Olivia began walking slowly toward me, her eyes filled with hurt but also clarity. And in that moment, I knew the hardest part wasn't exposing Daniel, it was watching my daughter realize the truth in front of hundreds of witnesses. And as the room held its breath, I remember thinking something that still stays with me. Sometimes protecting someone you love means breaking their heart first. But if you were Olivia, would you forgive your mother for exposing the truth at your wedding? Or would you never forgive her for ruining the most important day of your life?